Today I'm going to be painting a little scene with a deer and a small waterfall. As always, I start off with the sky, and rather than try and paint with smooth colors, if you use the selector tool and color fill and make big shapes and use Gaussian blur, it makes a very nice gradient and it's very, very quick. You'll notice I'm using the select freehand tool with the color fill like I've done in a bunch of videos, but if this is your first one, I generally don't use brushes. I will a little bit now and again when I need to do small details because the select tool color fill there is quite difficult. But what I tried to do here early on is get in the big shapes, and you can see there's about 4 or 5 big shapes, big masses, and it's important just to get those in, and the shapes look nice. So when we get all those in, I make sure they're on separate layers, so that's very important, so I can manipulate them and use various techniques to draw over the top of them while keeping in with their regions. So we'll get onto that when I get onto the second step with highlighting. But right now, I'm just trying to get the values correct, the shapes nice. And it's mostly about the shapes right now. The colors are just rough, like really rough. They don't really matter. The most important thing, though, is to make sure that the colors are darker than they need to be because we're going to lighten them up. Even if you're painting on one layer, you still need to think about multiple layers on top of the original layer. By that I mean you go dark to light generally, and then it's very difficult to go the other way around. It's almost impossible. So if you're gonna have a rock, for example, the rock will start off dark and it'll get light where the sun hits it. So just start off a really dark. You can't really go too dark because you can lighten it and lighten it and lighten it until you get to the highlight that you want. Whereas the other way around, you can't do that because you have to go around the highlights, etc. So just make sure the painting is too dark. And you can see right now the painting is very dark overall, but it's going to end up pretty light. I like painting light and colorful and overly saturated, etc. But I'll still start dark because it'll give it a nice undertone to when the highlights come about. So even though I have like 10 layers, I'm actually still painting in layers over just the one layer, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So I use if you go to your layer that you're working on, like I'm working on the water layer right now, click on the water layer and turn on the alpha lock. So just click on the layer and turn alpha lock on them, which means the color can't go outside it. It's very handy, and it means once you've got the shape correct, so this is why it was important that I got the shapes correct early on, that I can turn alpha lock on and start adding highlights and details and things like that. But the most important thing was I got the shapes right in the first place, because that's going to determine what the painting looks like overall. So regardless of what you do inside these shapes, if the shapes aren't nice in the first place, yeah, it's very difficult. Of course, we can go back and change the shapes a little bit, but not massively. Once you get those shapes in, it's kind of going to be what it's going to be. You can deform them and warp them and things like that. So that's a good idea if your shapes don't look nice. And what I mean by a nice shape is it has a contrast of sharp and smooth edges depending on what you're drawing. Nearly everything has a mix of both, and it's about finding the shapes that fit whatever you're doing. So obviously, if you're painting a tree, it's kind of more spiky, but it still has some curves, very, very small curves, but you still have to have a little bit of both, and know when to have straight edges or not. And certain items will have straight edges and certain items will not. For example, trees generally won't have a straight line that goes too far, so you need to be careful about trying to get the shapes. Whereas in a tree trunk, it will have more shapes. It'll have more straight edges because that's how trees grow. So once you learn how different items look shape-wise, then you can push it to your advantage. But basically, if this is early on for you, just try and keep the shapes simple. So I paint this way. I like painting this way with the selector tool because it makes you choose what shape you're going to have. Where if you use a brush, you'll fiddle and fiddle and fiddle, and it'll take a long time to get the shape you want because you're just making lines. If you use the selector tool, you kind of got to decide your shape. And if you notice the way I use the selector tool, though, I know this is sped up quite a lot, so it's maybe a little bit hard to see. But every time you make a shape, there's a little gray dot. So make a shape, hit the gray dot, and that will complete that shape. And then you can go on to another one. So if I don't get the right shape, what I do is put another shape over it and overlap and overlap and overlap this shape until I get the shape I want. So you'll see where these little dashes are drawn and animating, they'll have multiple ones over the other one. And that's so I can basically sculpt my shape, because getting a shape immediately correct is very difficult. So just do it over and over until you get the right shape. So I'm into the detailing now. So what that really means is I'm trying to add variation. So I'm working on the leaves. Now the sun is coming from the top left and kind of hitting every bit through the middle of the painting at a diagonal. It'll make a lot more sense later on when I put the sun rays in. But what you gotta imagine is it's coming down at an angle, and you need colorful, brighter things in this lane. It'll make sense when you see the sun later, but basically without the sun, even with or without big highlights, you need variations of color and shape. So that's what I do all the time, basically everywhere, is a difference of color, difference of value, difference of shape. Now that's what makes it interesting and is what's gonna just make your painting stand out, really. So I'm working on the highlights here, and like I said, the sun is coming from the top left corner. But you can't really do the sun until the end because the sun needs to go over everything. So you just got to keep in mind wherever you choose where the sun is coming from. One good trick is just to put a big arrow or something early on and stick it on a layer out of the way, and maybe just leave the arrow there, because quite often you can forget where the sun comes from. I've done that many times and put the shadows in the wrong place and highlights in the wrong place. It's not the end of the world. I've actually got some decent paintings where the highlights and the shadows are completely the wrong way around, and you can't really tell. So it's not as important as it seems. But I've got quite a lot of detail now, and one thing to be aware of is to make a painting balanced. You might hear the word balanced now and again. You have to make sure you have enough detail, but not too much. Now, I know that sounds, well, what's the answer? How do you know what too much is? It's, something you just learn over time that you've gone too far. If it's taken you ages to do this detail, then it's taken too long. This painting took me about an hour. So I'm pretty fast though, so that depends on how fast you paint. So, I'm not saying like if you take 6 hours is wrong. I just mean like in your normal speed, if it takes you 5 minutes to add a bit of detail and it's taking you 30, then you're probably going too far. So whatever your speed is, if you start doubling it to add detail, then you're doing too much, because it's not really going to help. And most of the time it actually hinders. So I'm coming on to the sun spot now, which I said is the top left. You're going to make that decision early because it affects everything. So I did, know this is coming from this. So I'm doing some sun rays. Sun rays look cool. And I don't paint them with soft brushes. Again, I use hard lines with the color fill and then use Gaussian blur to make them look nice and soft. I did that with the fog. I'm going to do another bit of fog later, and it works quite nice, and it's very fast. I like painting fast because if I start thinking, if I start overthinking things, it generally just gets worse. So speed for me is absolutely necessary. Even if I wanted to slow down, it's not a good idea because things for me get worse. I'm a overthinker and I need things to just flow naturally, or things don't go my way. So as you may notice, I go from the sun back to the rocks, back to the sun. I'll go back to the sun rays again later. And why I go back and forth is because every time I add something anywhere, it kind of messes up somewhere else. So you have to jump back and forth. So that was the Gaussian blur again. Look, I got a nice soft fog without actually painting it with a soft brush, and it's a very nice, easy technique. And now I said in a bunch of my videos that I need more life. I was maybe gonna paint a person, but and maybe I will. It's up to you. If you want to paint a person, then great. But I decided for a deer. And again, you can see me kind of sculpting with the select tool. Now I'm using a brush. The rare times I do, when I'm trying to get a little bit finer lines. When you use the select tool, it's a little bit tricky if the lines are really small. So don't be afraid to use brushes. I'm not saying don't use brushes. I just think the select tool and making shapes is just a lot faster, and it works for me. So hopefully it'll work for you too. But if not, just use the brushes. The concepts are the same. It's actually got nothing to do with the tool whatsoever. It's thinking about the composition and the colors and the values and the light and the shadow, etc. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the tool. So use whichever you feel comfortable with. But definitely try out the color fill select tool because it's pretty cool. And one thing is quite nice is you get very sharp lines, which is quite hard to do if you're just using the brush. So I'm messing around with adding this deer. And one thing you need to be careful about, and I've messed up many times previously, is you got to realize the focus of this painting is probably the rocks and the waterfall, the mini little waterfall. And I say probably because it's kind of up to the viewer what their focus is. But if you do it right, you can make them focus in the correct place, which is usually where you have the highest contrast. So it's usually whatever's closest to white and closest to black right next to each other. So the water is at its highest white, and it's got some dark bits with the black. So that's why it's the focus, and I've done that on purpose. So you got to make sure that if you add something else, like a deer or a person or whatever, and it's not the focus, and it's just, to add interest, you don't have it too contrasty and too colorful. So I've made this mistake many times, and I would go nuts with the deer, and it would stand out like crazy, and I was like, "Wee, that looks great." But that's kind of not the point. It's supposed to be supplementing the focus and not taking your eye away. So I think I've managed it on here, and the focus is still the little waterfall and the tree and the lights hitting there, and there happens to be a deer on the left. Perfect. So I'm coming to the end now and just adding a few details. So there we go. I like this one quite a lot, so hopefully you did too. And if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, give me a sub and like, and I'll do some more. And see you in the next one. Thanks.